Now, last week in our newsletter, we mentioned that schools are often struggling with some aspects of inclusion when it comes to their bilingual and multilingual learners. So today, I want to share more about that. And I've got three issues that I want to share, or three challenges. So, first of all, I want to talk about the terminology that we're using for our students. As many of you know, we like to use the terminology BML, bilingual and multilingual learner, or just multilingual learners. And so some schools haven't made that shift to recognizing their students as BMLs or MLs. Now, this might seem really trivial to some of you, but I want to share why it's not and why this is really the entry point to some really deep inclusive practices. So first of all, we have, an asset-based way of looking at our students when we refer to them as multilingual learners. We're acknowledging that they're coming with another culture, they're coming with a wide variety of linguistic skills. And so in that way, it helps us to broaden our perspective and recognize them from a strengths-based approach. But very practically, teachers often say, but our students are not bilinguals. They're coming in as absolute beginners into the classroom. And this was a comment that one teacher had made a couple of years ago when we were doing a workshop. And she was actually very passionate about this. And she didn't like the fact that we were using the words bilingual to describe a student who had just arrived to her school and was in one of her classes. And he arrived as a Mandarin speaker. And her school was an English speaking school. So she didn't like the fact that we were saying he was bilingual. So we tried to explain to her that the minute the student entered the classroom, he was having to process in that new language. He may not have had any proficiency at that point, but imagine within just a few days, that student would be able to communicate basic yes and no, and perhaps even making sense of some high frequency words or using some common terms to interact with others. So, in this way, we are having the student process and function in a new language, even at the most basic level. Now, of course, that can grow very quickly, the basic proficiency in the language. So we have to recognize what's actually happening to the student. They're functioning in two languages at different proficiency levels. Now he needs to attend to the directions and he needs to try and make sense of words and phrases in English. And so receptively, the student is doing quite a lot. It may look passive, but this is all part of the language proficiency that they're building. So they are using both of those languages. So they are bilingual. Now, one of the reasons we often don't think about this is because we have a very fixed way of understanding proficiency levels. Now, in an academic setting, we tend to look at high levels of proficiency as being the standard. But don't forget, there's so many people who function, including myself, in languages at lower proficiency levels, so at conversational levels. So this is really important to think about. So, I know if I go over to my local market, I can meet many people who have 6 or 7 languages at a basic proficiency level. And that means they're able to communicate on a day-to-day level, to get their needs met, to make a living, to understand different people. So, this is what I want you to acknowledge. Bilingualism is a range. It's from the beginning level of a language up to the high levels of academic fluency. So our students have a journey to get there, but it doesn't mean that they're not bilingual as they move from the earliest level up to the higher levels. So I want you to make that shift in your mindset when we begin to expand our concepts of bilingualism and multilingualism. We can start to implement practices that can suit our students much better. When we recognize a student has multiple languages, it really makes sense then to encourage translanguaging. So, encouraging them to tap in to their languages and use their full linguistic repertoire for different purposes, for different ways of expressing themselves and being themselves. So, I really think using more accurate descriptions will help us to have a good jumping off point to a variety of inclusive practices. So, the next point I want to talk about is enrichment versus remediation. Now, this relates to the research by Thomas and Collier. So it has to do with providing a rigorous, a challenging, a stimulating environment for our students where they are constantly learning and being stretched and growing, versus the approach where we have students working at lower levels, where they're not being challenged enough, where they are actually getting bored, or we're looking at them through the lens of lack. So we need to incorporate this philosophy across the school. It means we have to provide the right kind of academic challenge at the right level. And we also have to encourage our students to be independent learners. And so often I see educators struggle with this and they don't always know what to focus on when it comes to the enrichment. And one of the things I often talk about is focusing on having students become independent learners means that we need to support our students to access learning independently. So that might look like increasing their reading and literacy skills or opportunities, or even having them get access to alternative materials like Shakespeare in their home language, and that allows them to do the keep up with the learning, but then they can adapt the way they demonstrate their learning. It could be through pictures with labels on it in English, or it can be written text in their own home language. So we just need to keep our students learning and at the right pace. We can't let them stop learning and growing because they're also having to learn English. So those two things have to happen simultaneously. So this enrichment philosophy is extremely important. So you really need to make enrichment a key part of the role for your BML specialist teachers in your school. So they may take on different formats than they do right now. It might mean that some of their time goes to sourcing materials in different languages or in different levels that they can give to class teachers. So we need to be able to respond flexibly. For me, a big part of that has to do with the literacy skills, because the literacy opens the door to all the subject and curriculum learning. Now, we work a lot with schools and educators, especially helping them with the practical implementation of these things. But this philosophy is really critical to building up your inclusive policies and practices, especially when it comes to the nitty gritties of how you define your models of service and support. The other important thing to note is that you need to have high expectations. So don't be satisfied with the minimal progress. Are they making continuous gains? Maybe those gains are small or incremental, but they need to keep moving along. Now, I do want to mention that struggle can be part of this journey. It's very common. And if you're a person who's had to learn a new language, you know about that it's not always easy street. But we need to see how our students are moving forward and how they're progressing. And that way we can understand what they might need next. Now, but I look forward to hearing any of your personal experiences or any other thoughts you have about this. Bye for now.